Hello there, and welcome to this deep dive into one of history's most haunting professions. Before we begin, I'm curious, what time is it where you're watching this? And from which country are you joining us today? Whether you're tuning in from bustling Tokyo at midnight, sunny California in the afternoon, or rainy London in the evening, we're about to embark on a journey that transcends time and geography. Picture this. You're walking through the cobblestone streets of 14th century Europe when suddenly a figure emerges from the fog. Dressed entirely in black leather, wearing a mask with a grotesque beak that extends nearly 2 feet from their face, carrying a long wooden staff, they look more like a harbinger of death than a healer. This isn't a monster from your nightmares. This is a plague doctor, and their job was arguably one of the most terrifying, dangerous, and soul-crushing occupations in human history. Today, we're going to explore why being a plague doctor in medieval times was an absolute nightmare. A profession that combined the worst aspects of medicine, sociology, and human suffering into one horrific package. We'll uncover the daily horrors these men faced, the impossible decisions they had to make, and why many of them didn't last more than a few months in the job before either dying, going insane, or abandoning their posts entirely. But first, let's set the stage for this medieval horror story. The year is 1347. Europe is about to be hit by the most devastating pandemic in human history, the Black Death. Within 7 years, this plague will kill between 75 and 200 million people, wiping out 30 to 60% of Europe's entire population. Imagine if tomorrow, 1 out of every 2 people you know simply vanished. That's the scale of devastation we're talking about. In this world of unimaginable death and suffering, someone had to tend to the sick. Someone had to document the dying. Someone had to attempt treatments that had no basis in science, medicine, or even common sense. These someones were the plague doctors, and their existence was a living hell. Let's start with the most obvious problem: the costume. You've seen the images, that iconic black leather outfit with the terrifying beak mask. It looks dramatic in movies and video games, but imagine wearing that getup for 12 to 16 hours a day, while trudging through medieval streets filled with human waste, rotting corpses, and the constant stench of death. The leather outfit was designed to be completely sealed, supposedly to protect the doctor from bad air or miasma, which medieval people believed caused disease. The beak, which could extend up to 2 feet from the face, was stuffed with aromatic herbs, spices, and sometimes dried flowers, anything that might ward off the poisonous air. Popular choices included rosemary, thyme, lavender, mint, rose hips, carnation petals, and sometimes more exotic and expensive ingredients like cinnamon and cloves. But here's the thing about wearing a sealed leather suit in medieval Europe: air conditioning hadn't been invented yet. Neither had proper ventilation systems, deodorant, or really any understanding of hygiene as we know it today. These doctors were essentially walking around in what amounted to a leather oven, breathing through a stuffed bird beak, in climates that could range from freezing cold to sweltering hot. The mask itself was a nightmare. The eye holes were small and often covered with crystal or glass lenses, severely limiting vision. The beak made turning your head difficult and completely eliminated peripheral vision. Imagine trying to examine a patient, take notes, or even walk down a narrow medieval street while looking through what was essentially a leather telescope stuffed with herbs. Breathing was another constant struggle. The herbs in the beak, while aromatic, also restricted airflow. Many plague doctors reported feeling like they were slowly suffocating throughout their workday. The herbs would get damp from their breath, creating a humid, stuffy environment inside the mask that bred bacteria and made every breath a struggle. And then there was the psychological horror of the mask itself. Medieval people were already terrified of plague doctors. They were harbingers of death, after all. Children would run screaming when they saw one approaching. Adults would cross themselves and mutter prayers. The mask made the doctors look inhuman, monstrous, like some kind of demon sent to collect souls. This social isolation was devastating for men who were already dealing with the psychological trauma of watching thousands of people die horrible deaths every single day. But the costume was just the beginning of their problems. Let's talk about the actual work environment these men faced every day. Picture the most horrific scenes from every zombie movie you've ever watched. Then multiply that by 1,000 and add the smell. That was a typical day for a plague doctor. They would wake up each morning knowing they were about to walk into scenes of human suffering so extreme that many modern people couldn't even watch them in a movie. Medieval cities during plague outbreaks were essentially open-air morgues. Bodies were piled in the streets because there weren't enough living people to bury the dead. The smell was indescribable. Rotting flesh mixed with human waste, vomit, and the general stench of a city where basic sanitation had completely broken down. Plague doctors had to walk through these streets, stepping over and around corpses, many of which had been there for days or weeks. They had to knock on doors, many of which were marked with red crosses indicating plague houses, and enter homes where entire families lay dying or dead. Inside these homes, the scenes were even worse. Imagine walking into a house where a family of 8 lived and finding 7 corpses in various stages of decomposition, with one barely alive person begging for help. This wasn't an occasional occurrence. This was every single house, every single day. The plague itself caused horrific symptoms. Victims would develop massive, painful swellings called buboes in their lymph nodes, typically in the groin, armpits, and neck. These buboes could grow as large as apples and were excruciatingly painful. The skin around them would turn black, giving the disease its name, the Black Death. But the buboes were just the beginning. Patients would develop high fevers that caused delirium and hallucinations. They would vomit blood. Their skin would develop dark patches as blood vessels burst underneath. Many would develop gangrene in their extremities, causing fingers and toes to literally rot off while the person was still alive. The smell inside plague houses was beyond description. It was the smell of rotting flesh mixed with vomit, blood, feces, and the sweet, cloying smell of infection. Remember, these doctors were wearing sealed leather suits with limited ventilation, so every smell was concentrated and trapped around their faces for hours at a time. And what could they do to help? Absolutely nothing that actually worked. Medieval medicine was based on the theory of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of these humours, so their treatments focused on restoring balance through bloodletting, purging, and induced vomiting. Imagine being a plague doctor and having a family beg you to save their dying child. You know the child is going to die. You've seen it happen thousands of times before, but you also know that the family expects you to do something, anything, to try to help. So you perform treatments that you probably suspect are useless, watching helplessly as the child suffers and dies anyway. Bloodletting was one of the most common treatments. Doctors would use leeches or make cuts in the patient's skin to drain blood, believing this would help balance the humours. Of course, this just weakened patients who were already fighting for their lives. Many plague doctors reported the horror of watching patients die faster after bloodletting, knowing they had potentially hastened their deaths while trying to help. Other treatments were equally useless and often harmful. Doctors would prescribe various concoctions made from herbs, animal parts, and sometimes human waste or urine. They would burn aromatic substances in the patient's room, believing this would cleanse the air. They would apply hot poultices to the buboes, often causing them to burst and spread infection. Some treatments were based on astrological beliefs. Doctors would consult star charts and planetary alignments to determine the best times for treatment. They would prescribe wearing certain amulets or reciting specific prayers. All of this while patients lay dying in agony and families begged for miracles that medicine simply couldn't provide. The psychological toll of this constant failure was enormous. These were educated men who had studied medicine and genuinely wanted to help people. Yet every single day they watched their patients die despite their best efforts. They had to look family members in the eye and tell them there was nothing more they could do. They had to watch children die while their parents pleaded for just one more treatment, one more chance. Many plague doctors developed what we would now recognize as severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. They would have nightmares about the faces of patients they couldn't save. They would become obsessed with death, unable to think about anything else. Some became alcoholics, trying to numb the constant emotional pain. Others became reclusive, unable to form relationships, because they associated human connection with loss and suffering. But perhaps even worse than the medical failures was the social isolation that came with the job. Plague doctors were essential to society, but they were also feared and shunned. People needed them, but they also blamed them for the deaths that seemed to follow in their wake. It's a classic case of shooting the messenger. When someone's job is to be present during the worst moments of people's lives, they become associated with those terrible moments. Children would run from plague doctors in the streets. Adults would avoid eye contact and cross to the other side of the road. Shopkeepers would refuse to serve them or would make them leave their money on the counter rather than risk touching their hands. Even other medical professionals would shun plague doctors, seeing them as harbingers of death rather than healers. This social isolation was particularly cruel because many plague doctors had families of their own. They would come home after a day of witnessing unimaginable suffering, only to find that their own neighbors treated them like pariahs. Their children might be excluded from playing with other children. Their wives might be shunned by other women in the community. And the irony was that plague doctors were often at just as much risk of contracting the disease as anyone else. Their leather suits provided some protection, but they weren't foolproof. Many plague doctors died from the very disease they were trying to treat. Their families would then face not only grief, but also the stigma associated with plague deaths. Some plague doctors tried to maintain normal social lives, but it was nearly impossible. How do you make small talk with neighbors when you've spent the day watching entire families die? How do you enjoy a meal when you've been surrounded by the smell of death and decay? How do you sleep peacefully when you know that tomorrow you'll witness more suffering than most people see in a lifetime? Many doctors reported feeling like they were living in two different worlds. The world of normal people who worried about everyday problems, and the world of plague and death that they inhabited during their working hours. The contrast was jarring and made it difficult to relate to anyone who hadn't experienced the same horrors. Let's talk about the economics of being a plague doctor, because even the financial aspects of the job were problematic. During plague outbreaks, normal economic systems broke down. People were dying so quickly that there wasn't time for normal business transactions. Many families couldn't pay for medical services because the breadwinners had died or were too sick to work. Others had money but couldn't access it because banks and moneylenders had closed or died. Plague doctors were often paid by city governments rather than individual patients, but these payments were irregular and often came too late to be useful. Some doctors would go months without being paid, struggling to support their own families while working full-time, treating plague victims. The irregular pay also meant that many plague doctors were essentially trapped in their jobs. They couldn't afford to quit because they needed the income, but they also couldn't afford to continue because the work was destroying their health and sanity. Some doctors took on debt trying to support their families. then found themselves unable to leave the profession because they needed to work off their debts. There was also the constant risk of being blamed for treatment failures and having pay withheld as punishment. If a prominent citizen died under a plague doctor's care, the doctor might not only lose payment for that case, but might also face lawsuits or even criminal charges from the family. Some plague doctors tried to supplement their income by selling treatments or protective amulets to healthy people, but this often backfired. People were suspicious of anyone associated with the plague, and many believed that plague doctors actually spread the disease rather than treating it. The financial stress added another layer of misery to an already unbearable job. Doctors had to worry not only about their patients' suffering and their own safety, but also about how they would feed their families and keep roofs over their heads. Now let's discuss the working conditions in more detail, because the day-to-day reality of being a plague doctor was even worse than most people imagine. A typical workday for a plague doctor began before dawn. They would put on their leather suits, which could take up to an hour to properly seal and adjust. The suits were heavy, often weighing 30 to 40 pounds when fully equipped, and cumbersome. Just getting dressed was exhausting. Once suited up, doctors would begin making their rounds through the city. They carried long wooden or metal staffs, supposedly to examine patients without getting too close, but really to help them navigate through streets filled with obstacles, debris, waste, and corpses. The first challenge of each day was simply getting around the city. Medieval streets were narrow, winding, and poorly maintained even under normal circumstances. During plague outbreaks, they became obstacle courses of death and decay. Doctors had to step carefully to avoid tripping over bodies or falling into open sewers that had overflowed, because there weren't enough living people to maintain them. The smell was overwhelming from the moment they stepped outside. It was a combination of rotting flesh, human waste, vomit, and the general stench of a city where normal sanitation had completely broken down. Remember, these doctors were breathing this air for 12 to 16 hours a day through their stuffed bird beaks. Navigating between houses was dangerous, not just because of the physical obstacles, but also because of the social dangers. Desperate people would sometimes attack plague doctors, either blaming them for the plague or trying to rob them of medical supplies or money. Some doctors traveled with armed guards, but this added to their expenses and made them even more intimidating to the communities they were trying to serve. Once they reached a plague house, the real horror began. The first challenge was often just getting inside. Many plague houses had been sealed shut by authorities to prevent the spread of disease, so doctors had to break in or convince officials to unseal the doors. Sometimes they would arrive to find that everyone inside had died days or weeks earlier, and the bodies had been decomposing in sealed rooms. The smell inside plague houses was indescribable. It was concentrated death, the smell of rotting flesh trapped in small, poorly ventilated spaces. Many doctors reported that even with their aromatic herbs, the smell would make them vomit inside their masks, creating another layer of horror, as they had to continue working while breathing their own vomit. The visual scenes inside these houses were equally traumatic. Doctors would find entire families dead in their beds, often in positions that suggested they had died while trying to care for each other. Children clutching dead parents, parents cradling dead infants, elderly grandparents who had outlived their entire families and died alone. But perhaps worse were the houses where some people were still alive. Doctors would find survivors who had been living with corpses for days or weeks, often delirious from fever and dehydration. These survivors would beg for help, for water, for food, for someone to remove the dead bodies from their homes. The practical challenges of treating patients in these conditions were enormous. Doctors had to work by candlelight or oil lamps in rooms with poor ventilation. They had to examine patients while wearing bulky gloves and looking through small eye holes in their masks. They had to take notes while their hands were shaking from exhaustion and emotional stress. And then there were the treatment procedures themselves. Many treatments required doctors to get physically close to patients, lancing buboes, applying poultices, administering medicines. This meant coming into direct contact with infected blood and pus, despite their protective gear. Lancing buboes was particularly horrific. The doctor would use a sharp knife to cut open the swollen lymph nodes, releasing a mixture of blood, pus, and infected tissue. The smell was overwhelming, the patient's screams were heartbreaking, and the procedure rarely helped. Often it just created new sites for infection and hastened the patient's death. Bloodletting was another nightmare procedure. Doctors would make cuts in patients' arms or legs, or apply leeches to drain blood. Weak, dehydrated patients would often faint or go into shock from the blood loss. Some would die during the procedure, and doctors had to watch life leave their patients' eyes while they were actively trying to help. The psychological impact of these failed treatments was devastating. Doctors knew they were causing pain and potentially hastening deaths, but they also knew that families expected them to do something. The choice was between performing useless and harmful treatments or doing nothing and facing accusations of not caring or not trying hard enough. Many doctors developed elaborate rituals around their treatments, not because they believed the rituals worked, but because they needed to feel like they were doing something meaningful. They would pray over patients, burn incense, arrange herbs in specific patterns, or perform other ceremonial acts that gave structure to an otherwise chaotic and hopeless situation. The emotional toll of watching treatment after treatment fail was enormous. Doctors would become obsessed with finding new treatments, trying increasingly desperate and bizarre remedies. Some would spend their own money on exotic ingredients or expensive equipment, hoping to find something that worked. Others would become paralyzed by indecision, unable to choose between treatments that they knew were all equally useless. Let's talk about the specific medical horrors that plague doctors witnessed every day, because the symptoms of plague were uniquely traumatic to observe and treat. The bubonic plague, which was the most common form during the Black Death, caused massive swellings in the lymph nodes. These buboes would appear first in the groin, armpits, or neck, and would grow rapidly over the course of hours or days. Imagine watching a patient develop a swelling the size of a golf ball, then a tennis ball, then a small melon, all while the patient screamed in agony. The skin around the buboes would turn black and begin to die, creating areas of gangrenous tissue that would rot while the patient was still alive. The smell of gangrene is distinctive and horrible. It's the smell of rotting meat, but worse, because it's human flesh, and it's happening to someone who is still conscious and aware. Many patients would develop secondary infections in their buboes. The dead tissue would become infected with other bacteria, creating abscesses that would leak pus and infected fluid. Doctors would have to clean these wounds while patients screamed, knowing that their ministrations were probably making the infections worse rather than better. The pneumonic form of plague was even worse to witness. This version attacked the lungs, causing patients to cough up blood in massive quantities. Imagine walking into a room and finding someone literally drowning in their own blood, coughing up bright red foam while struggling to breathe. Pneumonic plague victims would develop severe difficulty breathing. They would gasp for air like fish out of water, their faces turning blue from lack of oxygen. The sound they made while trying to breathe was horrible, a wet, rattling noise that doctors said haunted their dreams long after patients died. The blood that pneumonic plague victims coughed up wasn't just a little blood mixed with spit. It was massive quantities of bright red blood that would spray across rooms when patients coughed. Doctors would find walls, floors, and bedding covered in blood. The smell of all this blood, mixed with the smell of infection and dying tissue, was overwhelming. But perhaps the most psychologically traumatic aspect of pneumonic plague was how quickly it killed. Patients could seem relatively healthy in the morning and be dead by evening. Doctors would arrive to treat someone who was walking and talking, only to return a few hours later to find a corpse. The septicemic form of plague was the most horrific of all. This version caused blood poisoning that would make patients' skin turn black all over their bodies. They would literally turn black while still alive, earning the disease its nickname of the Black Death. Septicemic plague victims would develop massive internal bleeding. They would vomit blood, defecate blood, and bleed from their eyes, nose, and mouth. Some would develop subcutaneous bleeding that would make their entire bodies turn purple and black. Imagine trying to treat someone who looked like they had been dead for days, but was still conscious and begging for help. The psychological symptoms of plague were equally disturbing. High fevers would cause delirium and hallucinations. Patients would scream about demons or monsters that only they could see. They would beg doctors to save them from imaginary threats while ignoring the very real disease that was killing them. Some plague victims would become violent during their delirium. They would attack family members or doctors, not out of malice, but because they were hallucinating and didn't recognize the people trying to help them. Doctors had to restrain delirious patients while trying to treat them, adding physical danger. To an already traumatic situation, the final stages of plague were particularly hard to witness. Patients would often become completely delirious, speaking to dead relatives or crying out for help that couldn't come. They would thrash around in their beds, reopening wounds and making their suffering worse. Some would try to get up and walk, falling and injuring themselves because they were too weak to stand. Death from plague was rarely peaceful. Patients would often die in the middle of violent coughing fits, choking on their own blood. Others would die while screaming from pain or terror. The moment of death was often accompanied by the release of bodily fluids, adding to the horror and mess that doctors had to deal with. And through all of this, plague doctors had to maintain their composure and continue trying to help. They had to hold the hands of dying patients, comfort grieving families, and make decisions about treatments, even though they knew nothing they did would make any real difference. The record-keeping requirements of plague doctors added another layer of psychological trauma to their work. They were required to document every case they treated, including detailed descriptions of symptoms, treatments attempted, and outcomes. This meant they had to relive the horrors of each day while writing their reports. These reports were supposed to help medical authorities track the spread of the plague and evaluate the effectiveness of different treatments. In reality, they became catalogues of failure and suffering. Doctors would write entry after entry describing patients who died despite treatment, families that were wiped out, and treatments that caused more harm than good. Many plague doctors, journals that have survived to this day, make for incredibly difficult reading. They're filled with clinical descriptions of unimaginable suffering, written by men who were clearly struggling with the emotional impact of what they were witnessing. Some doctors wrote about their own psychological states in their journals. They described nightmares, anxiety, depression, and a constant sense of hopelessness. They wrote about feeling like they were trapped in hell, surrounded by death and suffering with no way to escape. When treating poor patients, doctors often face different problems. These families might not be able to pay for treatment, but doctors were still expected to provide care. Some doctors were criticized for spending too much time with wealthy patients and not enough with the poor. Others were criticized for wasting resources on poor patients who weren't worth saving. The gender dynamics were also complicated. Most plague doctors were men, but they often had to treat women and children in intimate settings. Medieval society had strict rules about male-female interactions, and doctors had to navigate these social expectations while trying to provide medical care. Some families were uncomfortable with male doctors examining female patients, but there were very few female medical practitioners available. Doctors had to balance medical necessity with social propriety, often making treatment more difficult and less effective. The treatment of children was particularly emotionally challenging. Medieval society had different attitudes toward children than we do today, but watching children suffer and die was still traumatic for most doctors. The medical techniques available were often too harsh for small bodies, and doctors had to watch children die from treatments that might have been survivable for adults. Let's delve into the specific daily routines that made life so miserable. For plague doctors, a typical day began around 4 or 5 a.m., not by choice, but because the psychological stress of the job made it difficult to sleep. Many doctors reported chronic insomnia, nightmares, and anxiety that would wake them in the early hours of the morning. The process of getting dressed was elaborate and time-consuming. The leather suit had to be carefully inspected for holes or tears that might allow contaminated air to enter. Every seam had to be checked, every strap had to be properly tightened, every piece of equipment had to be accounted for. The beak mask required daily preparation. The aromatic herbs and spices had to be replaced regularly because they would become damp and moldy from the doctor's breath. Some doctors would spend significant amounts of their own money on expensive spices, hoping that better ingredients might provide better protection. Once dressed, doctors would review their lists of patients and plan their routes through the city. This wasn't just a matter of efficiency, it was a matter of survival. Doctors had to avoid certain areas where violence was common, plan around quarantine zones, and account for streets that might be blocked by bodies or debris. The walking itself was exhausting. The leather suits were heavy and restricted movement. The masks limited vision and made it difficult to navigate obstacles. In hot weather, doctors would overheat quickly. In cold weather, the suits provided little insulation and doctors would freeze. Each house visit followed a similar pattern of horror. Knock on the door and wait to see if anyone answered. If no one answered, break in or find another way to enter, knowing that everyone inside was probably dead. If someone answered, brace for the scenes of suffering that awaited inside. The actual medical examinations were perfunctory at best. With limited vision, bulky gloves, and restricted movement, doctors couldn't perform detailed physical examinations. Most diagnosis was based on observation of obvious symptoms, the presence of buboes, the color of the patient's skin, the sound of their breathing. Treatment decisions had to be made quickly because doctors had dozens of other patients to see each day. There wasn't time for careful consideration or consultation with other medical authorities. Doctors had to rely on standard protocols that they knew were probably useless. The administration of treatments was often traumatic for both doctor and patient. Lancing buboes required holding down delirious patients while they screamed. Bloodletting involved watching already weak patients become weaker. Administering medicines meant forcing bitter, probably harmful concoctions down the throats of people who were already suffering. The documentation requirements meant that doctors had to take notes during or immediately after each visit. This required removing their gloves to write, potentially exposing themselves to infection. It also meant that they couldn't mentally distance themselves from what they had just witnessed. They had to immediately write down every horrible detail. Travel between houses was often as traumatic as the house visits themselves. Streets were filled with scenes that would be unimaginable in normal times. Corpses piled on street corners, sometimes stacked 10 or 15 high. Wild dogs and rats feeding on human remains. The sounds of grief and suffering coming from every building. The social interactions during these travels were consistently negative. People would run away when they saw a plague doctor approaching. Others would shout curses or blame them for the plague. Some would beg desperately for help that the doctors knew they couldn't provide. By midday, most doctors were already exhausted, but they still had hours of work ahead of them. The heat inside the leather suits was becoming unbearable. Their vision was becoming more impaired as their eye holes fogged up, and the emotional stress was becoming overwhelming. Lunch was often impossible. Taking off the mask to eat meant potential exposure to infection. Eating while wearing the mask was impossible. Many doctors would go entire days without eating, which added physical weakness to their other problems. The afternoon rounds were often worse than the morning ones. Patients who had been alive in the morning were now dead. New patients had developed worse symptoms. The accumulation of death and suffering throughout the day made each new house visit more emotionally devastating. Evening brought its own challenges. Doctors had to return to houses where patients had died to comfort families and make arrangements for body removal. They had to visit city officials to provide reports on the day's cases. They had to prepare for the next day's rounds. The process of removing the protective gear at the end of the day was elaborate and dangerous. Every piece had to be carefully cleaned with vinegar or other substances believed to have disinfectant properties. The beak had to be emptied and refilled with fresh herbs. The leather had to be inspected for damage and repaired if necessary. By the time doctors returned home, they were usually physically and emotionally exhausted. But home didn't provide the refuge it should have. Their families were often afraid of them, worried that they might bring the plague home. Neighbors avoided them. Normal social interactions were impossible. The evenings were supposed to be for rest and recovery, but most plague doctors found it impossible to relax. They would have nightmares about the patients they couldn't save. They would lie awake, worrying about the patients they would see tomorrow. They would obsess over whether they had made the right treatment decisions. Many doctors turned to alcohol to cope with the stress. Wine and beer were safer to drink than water in medieval times anyway, but during plague outbreaks, many doctors would drink heavily to numb the emotional pain. This created additional health problems and often made their work performance worse the next day. Some doctors tried to maintain normal hobbies or interests, but it was nearly impossible. How do you enjoy music when you've spent the day listening to death rattles? How do you appreciate art when you've been surrounded by images of suffering? How do you engage in intellectual conversation when your mind is filled with memories of medical failures? The social isolation was particularly cruel in the evenings. These were educated, cultured men who were used to engaging in stimulating conversations and social activities. But their association with the plague made them unwelcome in normal social settings. They would spend their evenings alone, with only their traumatic memories for company. Let's examine the long-term psychological effects that plague doctors experienced. Because the trauma of this job didn't end when the plague outbreaks ended. Many plague doctors developed what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. They would have flashbacks to particularly traumatic cases, often triggered by ordinary sights, sounds, or smells. The scent of certain herbs might remind them of their beak masks. The sound of coughing might trigger memories of pneumonic plague. Victims. The sight of anyone who was ill might cause panic attacks. The hypervigilance that kept them alive during plague outbreaks often persisted long after the danger had passed. Former plague doctors would constantly scan their environment for signs of disease. They would avoid crowded places, refuse to shake hands, and maintain elaborate hygiene rituals that seemed excessive to others. Sleep disorders were common among former plague doctors. Many reported chronic insomnia, night terrors, and dreams, filled with images of death and suffering. Some would wake up screaming, reliving particularly traumatic patient encounters. Others would avoid sleep altogether, staying awake for days at a time to avoid the nightmares. Depression was nearly universal among plague doctors who survived their service. The constant exposure to death and suffering, combined with the sense of professional failure, created a deep sense of hopelessness that was difficult to overcome. Many former plague doctors lost interest in activities they had previously enjoyed, withdrew from social relationships, and reported feeling empty or numb most of the time. Anxiety disorders were also common. Former plague doctors would develop phobias related to disease, death, or medical treatment. Some became obsessed with their own health, constantly checking for signs of illness. Others developed agoraphobia, becoming afraid to leave their homes because they associated the outside world with death and disease. Survivor's guilt was perhaps the most devastating psychological effect. Plague doctors had watched thousands of people die while they themselves survived. Many struggled with questions about why they had lived when so many others had died. Some felt guilty about their medical failures, convinced that they could have saved more lives if they had been better doctors or tried harder. This guilt was compounded by the social blame that plague doctors often faced after outbreaks ended. Communities looking for someone to blame for their losses would sometimes target the doctors who had been present during the worst times. Former plague doctors might find themselves accused of spreading the disease, profiting from suffering, or not doing enough to help. The religious crisis that many plague doctors experienced was profound and lasting. Men who had been devout Christians before the plague often found their faith shattered by the suffering they had witnessed. How could a loving God allow such horrible deaths? Why would divine providence permit innocent children to die in agony? While sinful adults survived, some former plague doctors became atheists or agnostics, unable to reconcile their religious beliefs with their experiences. Others became obsessively religious, spending hours in prayer and penance, trying to atone for their perceived failures. Still, others developed their own unique theological views, often focusing on concepts of suffering, redemption, and the nature of evil. The impact on family relationships was severe and long-lasting. Many plague doctors returned from their service to find that their families had changed during their absence. Children had grown up without fathers who were present even when they were physically at home, because the psychological trauma made emotional connection difficult. Marriages often suffered or ended entirely. Wives found themselves living with men who were fundamentally changed by their experiences. Former plague doctors might be emotionally unavailable, prone to violent outbursts, or obsessed with death and disease. The intimacy and trust that marriages require were often casualties of the psychological trauma. Some former plague doctors became unable to form new relationships at all. The constant exposure to loss and death made them afraid to become emotionally attached to anyone. They would isolate themselves, convinced that everyone they cared about would eventually die and leave them to suffer alone. The professional consequences were equally devastating. Many plague doctors found that their medical careers were effectively over after serving during outbreaks. Other doctors might refuse to work with them, seeing them as contaminated or unlucky. Patients might refuse their services, associating them with death rather than healing. Some former plague doctors tried to continue practicing medicine, but found that they were unable to treat patients effectively. They might have panic attacks when examining sick people, or become paralyzed by indecision when choosing treatments. The trauma had damaged their ability to function as medical professionals. Others left medicine entirely, unable to face the possibility of witnessing more suffering. But changing careers was difficult for men who had spent years studying medicine and had few other marketable skills. Many ended up in poverty, unable to support themselves or their families. The substance abuse problems that many plague doctors developed during their service often persisted and worsened after the outbreaks ended. Without the structure and purpose that their work provided, Some former plague doctors would drink heavily all day, using alcohol to numb the emotional pain and fill the empty hours. The social stigma attached to plague doctors often followed them for the rest of their lives. Even years after outbreaks ended, people would remember and avoid men who had served as plague doctors. This made it difficult to rebuild social connections and find acceptance in their communities. Some former plague doctors became wanderers, unable to settle in any one place because of the memories and associations. They would travel from town to town, never staying long enough to form relationships or establish roots. This nomadic lifestyle often led to further isolation and psychological deterioration. The physical health effects of serving as a plague doctor were also significant and long-lasting. The constant stress, poor nutrition, and exposure to disease took a toll on their bodies. Many developed chronic health problems that persisted for years after their service ended. Respiratory problems were common, probably caused by breathing contaminated air through the primitive masks for extended periods. Former plague doctors often developed chronic coughs, shortness of breath, and other lung problems that made physical activity difficult. Digestive problems were also frequent, possibly caused by the stress, poor diet, and exposure to various herbal treatments that doctors sometimes tested on themselves. Many former plague doctors suffered from chronic stomach pain, nausea, and other gastrointestinal issues. The physical effects of wearing heavy, restrictive leather suits for months or years were also significant. Many former plague doctors developed chronic back pain, joint problems, and muscle weakness. The constant weight and restriction of movement had permanently damaged their bodies. Now, let's examine the specific cases and stories that illustrate just how horrific this profession really was. Giovanni de Ventura was a plague doctor in Florence during the outbreak of 1348. His journal, which survived in fragmentary form, provides a first-hand account of the daily horrors he faced. In one entry, he describes arriving at a house where he found a mother who had been dead for 3 days, still clutching her infant child who was somehow still alive but dying of starvation and dehydration. De Ventura wrote about trying to save the infant, but lacking the knowledge or resources to care for such a young child without its mother. He watched the baby die over the course of several hours, unable to do anything meaningful to help. This case haunted him for the rest of his short life. He died of plague himself just 6 months later, but not before writing extensively about his guilt and anguish over the infant's death. Another case from de Ventura's journal describes a family of 12 where he arrived to find 11 corpses and 1 survivor, a teenage girl who had been living alone with the bodies for over a week. She had been eating scraps of moldy bread and drinking rainwater that had collected in pots. When de Ventura found her, she was delirious from fever and dehydration, begging him to bring her family back to life. The girl died while de Ventura was trying to treat her, but not before she spent hours crying and calling out for her dead parents and siblings. De Ventura wrote that her cries were more terrible than the sounds of hell itself, and that he could still hear them in his dreams weeks later. From Paris, we have the account of Philippe de Mézières, who served as a plague doctor during the outbreak of 1361. His records describe treating an entire monastery where all 43 monks had contracted the plague. De Mézières visited the monastery daily for 2 weeks, watching as the monks died one by one, despite his treatments. What made this case particularly traumatic was that the monks maintained their religious services even as they died. De Mézières would arrive each morning to find fewer monks in the chapel, but those who were still alive would continue singing prayers and performing rituals even as they coughed up blood and collapsed from weakness. The final monk died while leading mourning. Prayers, collapsing at the altar while reciting psalms. De Mézières wrote that the sight of the empty monastery, with its silent chapel and rows of empty beds, affected him more deeply than any other case he encountered. He left the medical profession entirely after this experience and became a hermit. From London, we have the story of Thomas Bradwardine, who served as a plague doctor during the initial outbreak of the Black Death in 1348-1349. Bradwardine's account includes the story of treating the household of a wealthy merchant family where the plague struck during a wedding celebration. Bradwardine arrived to find that 23 wedding guests had fallen ill simultaneously. The bride and groom were among the victims, along with both sets of parents and most of the wedding party. The house, which had been decorated for celebration just days earlier, had become a death house, with bodies lying in the same rooms where the wedding feast had been held. What made this case particularly horrible was that some of the victims were still wearing their wedding clothes as they died. Bradwardine wrote about the surreal experience of trying to treat plague victims who were dressed in silk and velvet, surrounded by wedding decorations and the remains of a feast that had been abandoned when the plague struck. The bride died while still wearing her wedding dress, and Bradwardine was forced to help the groom, who was also dying, say goodbye to his new wife. Both died within hours of each other, never having had the chance to begin their married life together. These individual stories illustrate the broader psychological trauma that plague doctors face daily. They weren't just treating anonymous patients, they were witnessing the destruction of families, communities, and entire ways of life. The case records also reveal the impossible medical decisions that plague doctors had to make every day. With limited time and resources, they often had to choose which patients to treat and which to abandon. These triage decisions were psychologically devastating, especially when they involved children or young adults who might have had better chances of survival. Some plague doctors developed elaborate systems for making these decisions based on factors like the patient's age, social status, likelihood of survival, and ability to pay. Others made decisions based on emotional factors, treating patients who reminded them of family members or who were particularly pitiful in their suffering. The medical records from this period also reveal the desperation that drove plague doctors to try increasingly extreme and bizarre treatments. As conventional treatments failed repeatedly, some doctors began experimenting with procedures that were essentially torture. Some doctors tried cauterizing buboes with red-hot irons, believing that burning the infected tissue might stop the spread of the disease. This procedure was excruciatingly painful and usually killed patients faster than the plague itself. But desperate doctors, grasping for any treatment that might work, continued to use cauterization even after seeing it fail repeatedly. Other doctors tried surgical removal of buboes, cutting out the infected lymph nodes entirely. This procedure was usually fatal due to blood loss and infection, but some doctors convinced themselves that it was their duty to try every possible treatment, no matter how unlikely to succeed. The psychological records from this period also reveal the specific ways that the constant exposure to death affected plague doctors' mental states. Many developed obsessions with death that went far beyond their professional responsibilities. Some plague doctors became fascinated with the process of dying itself, spending hours observing patients in their final moments and taking detailed notes about the stages of death. Others became obsessed with corpses, studying dead bodies long after there was any medical reason to do so. These obsessions often disturbed the families of plague victims who found the doctor's behavior morbid and inappropriate. But for the doctors, these studies represented an attempt to understand and control something that felt completely beyond their control. The financial desperation of many plague doctors led to ethical compromises that added to their psychological burden. Some doctors began charging exorbitant fees to wealthy families, knowing that desperate people would pay anything for medical attention, even if it was unlikely to help. Others began selling fake treatments or protective charms to healthy people, profiting from fear while knowing that their products were useless. These ethical violations created additional guilt and shame that compounded the trauma of their medical failures. Some plague doctors tried to cope with their situation by developing elaborate philosophical or theological explanations for the plague. They would spend hours writing treatises about the meaning of suffering, the nature of divine justice, or the role of death in human existence. These intellectual exercises provided some psychological relief by giving meaning to an otherwise senseless situation. But they also revealed the depth of the doctor's psychological distress. Men who had once been practical medical practitioners had become obsessed with abstract questions about the nature of existence. The correspondence between plague doctors during outbreaks reveals the professional isolation they experienced. Even when multiple doctors were working in the same city, they often had little contact with each other due to quarantine restrictions and the demands of their work. The letters that have survived show men desperately trying to maintain some sense of professional community while dealing with unprecedented medical challenges. They would share information about treatments, compare case numbers, and offer each other emotional support as best they could through written communication. But these letters also reveal the competitive pressures that plague doctors faced. Some would exaggerate their success rates or downplay their failures in order to maintain their reputations. Others would criticize colleagues' treatment methods, creating professional conflicts even in the midst of crisis. The administrative burden of plague doctor work was enormous and added significantly to the psychological stress. Doctors were required to keep detailed records not just of their medical cases, but also of quarantine violations, public health measures, and social conditions in their assigned areas. This paperwork often took several hours each day and had to be completed, even when doctors were exhausted from their medical duties. The documentation requirements meant that doctors had to relive and analyze their failures in detail, making it impossible to forget or repress traumatic experiences. The reports that plague doctors filed with city authorities were often exercises in creative writing, as doctors tried to balance truthfulness with the political and social consequences of their words. Reporting too many deaths might cause panic. Reporting too few might lead to inadequate public health measures. The legal liability that plague doctors faced was constant and severe. Any treatment that resulted in a patient's death could potentially lead to criminal charges or civil lawsuits. Any failure to treat someone could result in accusations of negligence or abandonment. Some doctors tried to protect themselves by requiring written consent for all treatments, but this was often impractical during plague outbreaks when families were desperate and decisions had to be made quickly. The legal risks added another layer of stress to an already unbearable situation. The religious obligations that were imposed on plague doctors were often at odds with their medical training and personal beliefs. They were expected to provide last rites, lead prayers, and offer theological comfort to dying patients and their families. Many plague doctors had little theological training and felt inadequate to provide spiritual guidance. Others had lost their own faith due to their experiences and felt hypocritical, offering religious comfort that they didn't believe in themselves. The requirement to witness and sometimes assist with last rites meant that plague doctors were present for thousands of deaths. They had to watch the final moments of patients they had tried to save, often while families blamed them for the deaths or begged them to perform miracles they couldn't provide. Let's examine the broader social context that made being a plague doctor even more difficult than the medical challenges alone would suggest. Medieval society was highly structured and hierarchical, with clear expectations about social roles and relationships. Plague doctors occupied an unusual position in this hierarchy. They were educated professionals with important responsibilities, but they were also associated with death and failure in ways that undermined their social status. The social stigma attached to plague doctors was immediate and persistent. From the moment they put on their distinctive costumes, they became walking symbols of death and disease. Children were taught to fear them, adults crossed themselves when they passed, and even other medical professionals avoided associating with them. This stigma wasn't just inconvenient, it was psychologically devastating for men who had trained for years to be healers and who genuinely wanted to help people. The transformation from respected medical professional to feared harbinger of death happened quickly and was difficult to reverse even after plague outbreaks ended. The economic disruption caused by plague outbreaks made the financial situation of plague doctors even more precarious. Normal payment systems broke down when large numbers of people died or became too sick to work. Banks closed, trade ceased, and the usual methods of collecting fees became impossible. Many plague doctors found themselves working for months without payment, while their own families struggled to survive. Some accumulated significant debts trying to maintain their households while providing unpaid medical services. Others were forced to continue working even when they were sick themselves because they couldn't afford to stop. The breakdown of normal social institutions during plague outbreaks meant that plague doctors often had to take on responsibilities far beyond their medical training. They might be asked to serve as coroners, investigating unusual deaths. They might be required to enforce quarantine measures, essentially acting as public health police. They might be called upon to help with body disposal when normal burial systems became overwhelmed. These additional responsibilities added to their workload and stress, while also making them more unpopular with the communities they served. People resented plague doctors who enforced quarantines or who refused to provide optimistic prognoses that weren't supported by medical evidence. The communication challenges of medieval society made the isolation of plague doctors even worse. There were no telephones, no rapid postal systems, and no easy ways to maintain contact with colleagues or family members who were far away. Plague doctors often worked for months without any communication from the outside world. This isolation was particularly difficult for doctors who were working away from their home cities. They might spend months in unfamiliar places, surrounded by strangers who feared and avoided them, with no news from their families or friends back home. The technological limitations of medieval medicine meant that plague doctors were working with tools and techniques that were primitive even by the standards of their time. They had no understanding of germ theory, no effective medications, and no diagnostic tools beyond simple observation. This technological backwardness wasn't just a professional challenge. It was a source of constant frustration and guilt. Plague. Doctors were educated men who understood that their treatments weren't working, but they had no alternatives to offer. They knew they were failing their patients, but they didn't know why or how to do better. The scientific method, as we understand it today, didn't exist in medieval times, so plague doctors couldn't conduct systematic studies to evaluate their treatments or develop new approaches. They were stuck using traditional methods that had been passed down for generations, even when those methods clearly weren't effective. The information systems of medieval society were slow and unreliable, so plague doctors often found themselves working without accurate information about the scope of outbreaks or the effectiveness of treatments in other areas. They might spend months trying treatments that had already been proven useless elsewhere, or they might miss opportunities to try new approaches that were showing promise in other cities. The transportation limitations of medieval society made it difficult for plague doctors to move quickly between patients or to evacuate areas when outbreaks became overwhelming. They were often trapped in plague-stricken cities with no way to escape, even when their own safety was at risk. The housing and sanitation conditions of medieval cities made plague outbreaks worse and made the work of plague doctors more dangerous and unpleasant. Cities were overcrowded with poor drainage, limited clean water, and inadequate waste disposal systems. These conditions promoted the spread of disease and created environments that were horrible to work in. Plague doctors had to navigate through streets that were essentially open sewers, entering houses that had no ventilation systems and no clean water supplies. The basic living conditions of their patients made treatment more difficult and less likely to succeed. The food preservation and distribution systems of medieval society often broke down during plague outbreaks, creating additional health challenges that plague doctors had to address. Malnutrition made patients more susceptible to plague and less likely to recover from other treatments. Plague doctors themselves often suffered from poor nutrition during outbreaks as food became scarce and expensive. Working long hours while malnourished made their jobs even more physically demanding and emotionally draining. The legal systems of medieval society were not well equipped to handle the challenges created by plague outbreaks. There were few precedents for the legal issues that arose when large numbers of people died simultaneously, and plague doctors often found themselves involved in complex legal disputes about inheritance, property rights, and professional liability. Some plague doctors spent almost as much time dealing with legal issues as they did treating patients. They might be called to testify in court about the cause of deaths, the timing of deaths, or the mental competence of patients who had made deathbed wills. The military conflicts that were common in medieval Europe often complicated plague outbreaks and made the work of plague doctors more dangerous. Wars disrupted trade routes, damaged cities, and created refugee populations that were particularly vulnerable to disease. Some plague doctors found themselves working in cities that were under siege or in areas where military action was taking place. They had to deal with war injuries as well as plague cases, often while working under dangerous conditions. The political instability that often accompanied plague outbreaks made the work environment for plague doctors even more stressful. City governments might collapse or change hands frequently, leaving doctors without clear authority structures or consistent policies to follow. Some plague doctors found themselves caught in political conflicts, accused of loyalty to previous regimes or suspected of using their medical knowledge for political purposes. The combination of medical stress and political uncertainty was devastating for many doctors. Now let's look at the specific daily routines and practices that made life as a plague doctor so unbearable on a practical level. The morning preparation ritual that plague doctors had to perform each day was elaborate, time-consuming, and psychologically demanding. They would begin by inspecting their protective equipment for any signs of damage or contamination from the previous day's work. The leather suits had to be carefully cleaned with vinegar or other substances believed to have disinfectant properties. Every seam had to be checked for tears, every strap had to be tested for strength, and every piece of equipment had to be accounted for and cleaned. The beak masks required daily maintenance that was both expensive and unpleasant. The aromatic herbs and spices had to be replaced regularly because they would become damp and moldy from the doctor's breath. Good quality herbs were expensive, and many doctors spent significant portions of their income on mask supplies. The process of filling the beak with herbs was unpleasant because many of the substances were irritating to handle. Doctors would often develop rashes on their hands from handling certain herbs, and the strong scents would sometimes cause headaches or nausea even before they put the masks on. The psychological preparation for each day was perhaps even more challenging than the physical preparation. Plague doctors had to mentally prepare themselves for the horrors they would witness, the suffering they would be unable to prevent, and the deaths they would be unable to stop. Many doctors developed elaborate mental rituals to help them cope with this daily preparation. Some would pray for hours before beginning work. Others would read philosophical or religious texts to try to find meaning in their suffering. Still others would drink alcohol to numb their emotional responses. The route planning that plague doctors had to do each morning was complex and stressful. They had to decide which patients to visit first, which areas of the city were safe to travel through, and how to manage their time to see as many patients as possible while still providing adequate care. These decisions were often matters of life and death. A patient who was visited early in the day might have a better chance of survival than one who was visited later. But doctors had no way of knowing which patients were most critical, so they often had to make arbitrary decisions that haunted them later. The travel between patients was exhausting and dangerous. Plague doctors had to walk or ride through cities that had become obstacle courses of death and decay. Streets were filled with corpses, debris, and human waste. Buildings were abandoned or collapsed. Normal navigation landmarks were often destroyed or changed. The heavy protective equipment made travel even more difficult. The leather suits restricted movement and made it hard to climb over obstacles or navigate narrow passages. The masks limited vision and made it difficult to see hazards like holes in the street or unstable buildings. The social interactions during travel were consistently negative and psychologically draining. People would run away, shout curses, throw objects, or beg desperately for help that the doctors knew they couldn't provide effectively. These interactions were constant reminders of the doctor's failure and unpopularity. The house-to-house visits that made up the bulk of a plague doctor's day were exercises in accumulated trauma. Each house presented new scenes of horror, new examples of medical failure, and new families destroyed by disease. The physical act of entering plague houses was often difficult and dangerous. Doors might be barricaded by families trying to keep the disease out. Buildings might be structurally unsound due to abandonment and neglect. The interiors might be filled with obstacles, waste, and decomposing bodies. The sensory assault of entering plague houses was overwhelming. The smell was indescribable. Rotting flesh mixed with vomit, feces, and the general stench of disease and death. The sights were equally horrible. Corpses in various stages of decomposition, dying patients covered in blood and pustules, and the general chaos of households where normal life had completely broken down. The medical examinations that plague doctors performed were perfunctory by necessity, but psychologically devastating nonetheless. With limited time, restricted vision, and bulky equipment, doctors couldn't perform thorough examinations even when they wanted to. The diagnostic process was largely visual, looking for obvious signs like buboes, skin discoloration, or respiratory distress. But making diagnoses based on limited observation meant that doctors were constantly uncertain about their conclusions and treatments. The treatment decisions that plague doctors had to make were often impossible choices between equally ineffective options. They knew that most of their treatments didn't work, but they also knew that families expected them to do something. The pressure to provide treatment was enormous, but the available treatments were often harmful as well as useless. Doctors had to choose between potentially hastening their patients' deaths with aggressive treatments or appearing to abandon them by doing nothing. The administration of treatments was often traumatic for both doctor and patient. Lancing buboes required restraining delirious patients while they screamed in agony. Bloodletting involved watching already weak patients become weaker. Force-feeding medicines meant shoving bitter, potentially toxic substances down the throats of people who were already nauseated and vomiting. The documentation requirements meant that doctors had to record every detail of these traumatic encounters. They had to write down descriptions of symptoms, document failed treatments, and note the deaths that followed their ministrations. This documentation served as a constant reminder of their failures. Every evening, plague doctors would review their notes and be forced to confront the reality that most of their patients had died despite their efforts. The end-of-day routine was supposed to provide relief from the horrors of medical practice, but it often just created new sources of stress and trauma. The process of removing contaminated protective equipment was elaborate and dangerous. Every piece of equipment had to be carefully cleaned and inspected. The contaminated materials had to be disposed of safely. The doctor's body had to be thoroughly washed and examined for signs of infection. The psychological decompression from each day's work was often impossible. How do you relax and enjoy normal activities after spending the day surrounded by death and suffering? How do you make conversation with family members about ordinary concerns when your mind is filled with images of dying patients? Many plague doctors found that they were unable to participate in normal family life or social activities. They were physically present but emotionally absent, unable to connect with the everyday concerns of people who hadn't witnessed the same horrors. The sleep that should have provided respite from the day's trauma was often disrupted by nightmares, anxiety, and physical discomfort from the day's exertions. Many plague doctors developed chronic insomnia that made their work performance worse and their emotional state more fragile. The weekends and days off that plague doctors occasionally received were often more stressful than working days. Without the structure and purpose that work provided, doctors were left alone with their thoughts and memories. Many found that they actually preferred working to having free time because work at least kept their minds occupied. The long-term patterns of this daily routine created psychological damage that was cumulative and irreversible. Each day added new traumatic memories to an already overwhelming collection. Each failed treatment added to the sense of professional inadequacy. Each dead patient added to the guilt and grief that plague doctors carried. The seasonal variations in plague activity created additional psychological challenges. During the worst outbreak months, usually summer and early fall, doctors would work around the clock with no relief. During the quieter winter months, they would have time to reflect on their failures and dread the return of warm weather. The uncertainty about when outbreaks would end or how severe they would become made it impossible for plague doctors to plan for the future or maintain hope that their situation would improve. They lived in a constant state of anticipation of horror, never knowing if the next day would bring new outbreaks or if their current nightmare would continue indefinitely. Finally, let's examine what happened to plague doctors after the great outbreaks ended because their suffering didn't end when the plague subsided. The transition from active plague doctor to post-outbreak survivor was often more difficult than the plague service itself. During outbreaks, doctors had a clear purpose and role, even if that role was largely futile. After outbreaks ended, they were left with psychological trauma, damaged reputations, and unclear futures. Many former plague doctors found that they were unemployable in normal medical practice. Other doctors didn't want to associate with them, and patients were afraid of them. The association with death and disease that had made them valuable during outbreaks made them unwelcome during normal times. Some tried to reinvent themselves professionally, but their medical training was often their only marketable skill. Men who had spent years studying medicine found themselves working as laborers, clerks, or in other jobs that didn't require their education or experience. The financial situation of many former plague doctors was desperate. They had often worked for months without pay during outbreaks, accumulating debts and expenses that they couldn't repay. Their families had suffered economically during their service, and there was rarely any compensation or pension available for their sacrifices. The social reintegration of former plague doctors was often impossible. Communities remembered them as harbingers of death rather than as men who had risked their lives trying to help. Children who had been taught to fear plague doctors couldn't easily learn to accept them as normal community members. The psychological healing that former plague doctors needed was not available in medieval society. There were no therapists, no support groups, and no understanding of trauma and its treatment. Men who were suffering from what we would now recognize as severe PTSD were left to deal with their symptoms alone. Many former plague doctors became hermits or wanderers, unable to maintain relationships or settle in communities. They would travel from place to place, carrying their trauma with them and never finding peace or acceptance. The religious struggles that many plague doctors experienced often intensified after their service ended. During outbreaks, they were too busy to fully confront the theological questions raised by their experiences. Afterward, they had time to wrestle with questions about divine justice, the meaning of suffering, and the nature of good and evil. Some former plague doctors became obsessively religious, spending hours in prayer and penance. Others rejected religion entirely, unable to reconcile their faith with what they had witnessed. Still others developed their own unique theological views that often put them at odds with established religious authorities. The family relationships of former plague doctors were often permanently damaged. Wives and children who had lived in fear during the doctor's service often found it difficult to readjust to having them home. The emotional distance and psychological damage made normal family relationships difficult or impossible. Some marriages ended in divorce or separation, not because of lack of love, but because the psychological trauma had created unbridgeable gaps between spouses. Children often grew up feeling that they had lost their fathers, even though the men were physically present. The legacy of plague doctors was largely negative for centuries after the great outbreaks ended. They were remembered more as symbols of medical failure than as heroes who had risked their lives trying to help. Their distinctive costumes became associated with death and fear rather than with healing and sacrifice. This negative legacy added to the psychological burden that surviving plague doctors carried. They knew that history would not remember them kindly, that their sacrifices would not be appreciated, and that their failures would be remembered long after their efforts were forgotten. The medical knowledge that plague doctors accumulated during their service was largely wasted because of the primitive state of medieval science. They had observed thousands of cases of plague and had tried hundreds of different treatments, but they lacked the theoretical framework and research methods needed to draw useful conclusions from their experiences. Many former plague doctors tried to write medical treatises based on their experiences, but these works were often dismissed by other physicians or ignored by medical authorities. The knowledge they had gained through suffering was lost because medieval society lacked the institutions needed to preserve and build upon clinical experience. The few plague doctors who managed to rebuild their lives after their service often did so by completely abandoning medicine and starting over in entirely different fields. Some became merchants, others became clergy, and still others became craftsmen or farmers. These career changes represented not just practical necessity, but also psychological self-preservation. Many former plague doctors found that they could only heal from their trauma by completely separating themselves from anything associated with medicine or disease. The historical record of plague doctors' experiences was largely lost or ignored for centuries. Medieval society was not interested in preserving accounts of medical failure and psychological trauma. Most plague doctors' journals and records were destroyed or forgotten, taking with them the first-hand accounts of one of history's most traumatic medical experiences. It's only in recent centuries that historians have begun to piece together the reality of what plague doctors experienced and to recognize the scope of their suffering and sacrifice. Modern readers, with the benefit of psychological knowledge and medical understanding that wasn't available in medieval times, can begin to appreciate the true horror of being a plague doctor during the great outbreaks. The story of plague doctors serves as a reminder of how medical progress depends not just on scientific advancement, but also on the willingness of individuals to serve in impossible circumstances. These men volunteered to face horrors that most people couldn't imagine, armed with treatments they knew were largely useless, in service to communities that feared and blamed them. Their story is not just a historical curiosity, but a testament to human courage and dedication in the face of overwhelming odds. They failed medically, not because they lacked skill or dedication, but because they were working with the wrong tools at the wrong time in history. The plague doctors of medieval Europe remind us that behind every medical advance lie countless individual tragedies, doctors who tried and failed, patients who suffered and died, and families who lost everything despite the best efforts of the medical professionals of their time. Their legacy should not be their failures, but their willingness to serve, to sacrifice, and to continue trying even when success seemed impossible. In an age before modern medicine, before germ theory, before effective treatments, they did what they could with what they had. That they failed was inevitable. That they tried was heroic. And perhaps most importantly, their story reminds us that being a healer in times of crisis has always required not just medical knowledge, but also extraordinary psychological resilience, moral courage, and the ability to continue caring for others, even in the face of repeated failure and personal loss. The plague doctors of medieval Europe may have been unsuccessful in their primary mission of saving lives, but they succeeded in demonstrating the heights of human dedication and the depths of human sacrifice. Their story deserves to be remembered not as a tale of medical failure, but as an example of ordinary people attempting extraordinary service under impossible circumstances. In our modern world, with our advanced medical knowledge and sophisticated treatments, it's easy to forget how recently in human history doctors were working essentially blind, armed with good intentions, but little else. The plague doctors remind us how fortunate we are to live in an age of medical miracles, and how much we owe to the countless medical professionals who suffered and failed so that we might eventually succeed. Their story is ultimately one of human resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity, and of the price that medical progress has exacted from the individuals who were willing to serve on the front lines of humanity's battle against disease and death. So the next time you visit a modern hospital, receive effective medical treatment, or benefit from our understanding of how diseases spread and how they can be prevented, remember the plague doctors of medieval Europe, the men who put on their leather suits and bird masks, walked into houses of death, and tried to heal with tools that couldn't work, driven by dedication that never wavered even in the face of constant failure. They remind us that medical heroism isn't always about dramatic successes and miraculous cures. Sometimes it's about showing up every day to face impossible odds, to try treatments that probably won't work, and to provide comfort and care even when cure is impossible. In that sense, the plague doctors were not failures at all. They were the embodiment of the medical profession's highest ideals, the willingness to serve others regardless of personal cost, to persist in the face of failure, and to continue caring even when hope is gone. Their story may be one of medieval medicine's darkest chapters, but it's also one of humanity's most inspiring examples of service, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication to the welfare of others. They deserve to be remembered not for their failures, but for their courage,